Okay, so hello everybody. For this session today, I'm not going to talk about what a blockchain is, and we're not going to cover what DLT is or how it works, because the assumption is that everyone understands that sufficiently already. However, just to set some scene, some context, because this recording will be available for watching in the future. Today, it's Thursday, 6th June 2020. The COVID-19 outbreak is roughly 6 months old. We're still learning about how infection is spread, what the right treatment is. And at the moment, governments are trying to balance the impact on society versus the impact on the economy. So some countries in the West are exploring how to open up for business, while other countries are now only just entering that exponential growth phase. So as of today, there are around 7.5 million cases reported of COVID-19 infections. There have been 420,000 deaths associated with COVID-19 in some way, and that means there's effectively a fatality rate of over 5%, which is quite considerable. We look at the UK, the ONS data now says there's been over 65,000 deaths linked in some way to COVID-19, and that is growing. In the UK again, UK government has got a 5-step action plan, which was to contain, delay, mitigate, research, and they've been changing things so much, I couldn't even find what the 5th step was. So there we go on that. So what I'll do for this session is I'd like to ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves and their business, and then we have a series of topics and themes to discuss. And as Hugo mentioned before, be welcoming questions as we go along to the panel using the question and answer session. And I'll either incorporate them during our discussion or at the end as well. So with that, if I can hand over, first of all, to Genevieve. Are we online, Genevieve?
I don't think she's here yet, so perhaps
Okay.
we can start with Ellen, that's okay?
Yes, please. Helen, please introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Gary. My name's Helen Disney. I'm the CEO and founder of Unblocked, which is a platform for blockchain education and events, obviously virtual events these days rather than physical ones. In this context, I'm also representing the organization GovChain Research, which I co-founded 18 months ago, which was to look on a non-for-profit basis at how governments around the world are implementing blockchain in the public sector and how they're using it to solve social problems. So this is obviously highly relevant to what we're doing now. And we've started a spin-off called CovChain, which is looking at COVID-related projects for public good and public sector. So I'll talk a bit more about that later on in the session.
That's excellent. Thanks for that. And Jim Nasser.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, struggling with video and the mute button. Yes, this is Jim Nasser. I am the CEO of Acor. We are a software development company. We focus on essentially usable modern technologies for healthcare, but very much so with the idea that where it makes sense, blockchain enable that technology. And as it turns out in healthcare, I think there's a number of areas where it does make sense, particularly in terms of data provenance, assurity of information, information flow, not necessarily supply chain only, and other use cases. So that's really kind of what we're focused on over the last several months. We have been working with a consortium on COVID-19 related solutions, including a mobile app for diagnostics and triage, and a very extensive platform to support ingestion of data, as well as reporting to public health and things like this. So very much so kind of my daily life really is working with blockchain, healthcare, and COVID-19 related activities at this moment, and look forward to conversing with the rest of the panel.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Jim. And that then takes us nicely on to Duncan Johnson-Watt.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm with the company, I'm co-founder and CEO of Blockchain Technology Partners. Our focus as a company is really on enabling other people to innovate on both blockchain and smart contract infrastructure. So we're heavily involved in the open source community through things like Hyperledger and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So as we get into the conversation, I'll be talking about one or two of the initiatives we're involved in. not just from a practical point of view, but also through things like the Global Business Blockchain Business Council and so forth.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you for that, Duncan. And we're also hoping to be joined shortly by Genevieve Laville, who's the principal founder and CEO of AgriLedger. And AgriLedger have been doing some really interesting stuff around the blockchain space and provenance and traceability. So hopefully we'll be able to introduce her when she comes on board. Meanwhile, myself, I run my own emerging technology consultancy and education service. I've been working in blockchain projects for about 4 or 5 years now. I'm an ambassador for University of Nicosia and their digital online courses. I'm a technical advisor to organizations such as Clyde & Co., so a big law firm, and I'm a member of the techUK DLT working group, which is what's brought this session together today. So start off then by asking an initial question. And Helen, if we can start with you, you're saying with GovChain and such like, can you give some examples of what the governments are actually proposing?
So I think what this crisis has really shown us is how important digital transformation is. And it's sort of something that tends to be always set as an aspiration by governments, you know, by 2030, by X date, we will suddenly, you know, have a lot more of our services available digitally, but in reality, that doesn't always happen. So what we did with GovChain was try to map actually what governments were doing around the world, not every country, but we mapped around, I think, 22 jurisdictions so far, looking at what they're doing. And I think what we've seen is there's a few sort of key areas. I mean, previous to COVID, we were looking at things like in the healthcare space, medical credentialing, and I think that's still valuable, particularly in the current scenario. Things like supply chain implementations, again, very relevant to COVID when we're looking at governments procuring large amounts of goods from countries and maybe not being able to be sure whether the quality of those goods is sufficient. And I think Genevieve is going to talk a bit more about that, how we can actually get trust in the supply chain when we're trying to procure large amounts of, you know, PPE and things like that. And in an emergency, people tend to sort of panic buy, and, you know, whether it's toilet roll or whether it's PPE, governments are doing the same thing as individual consumers. They're sort of panic buying. So how can we prevent wasting public money? And I mean, there are some concrete things that have been done. So one of our conclusions in our GovChain research was that the countries that tended to do better had collaborative procedures to help them understand technology and help them test out emerging tech. So sandboxes, for example, tend to be prevalent in countries that are doing well. We ranked countries on a traffic light system of sort of red, amber and green, and the green countries all tended to have some kind of regulatory sandbox. So the UK actually in May announced that they were going to take their blockchain sandbox digital, which is great, so that people can actually keep the sandbox activity going even though they can't physically necessarily be together in person, and also that there'd be a priority for supporting any initiatives that were coronavirus related. So that could be, you know, remote care for health. It could be, you know, speeding up benefit payments or payments to people who are struggling with, let's say, meal vouchers. I mean, one of the big problems government has had is actually getting money out to people, or getting, you know, laptops out to schools. And a lot of this can be sort of sped up if we could have more payments going in a frictionless way. So those are just a few of the things. I mean, in terms of actual use cases, obviously we've got Jim here who's going to talk a bit about what ACOR are doing with accurate data mapping. And I think one of the key things is government's role in this has grown because we need government to act. And one of the things we need is trust. So trust in data, what's actually going on with the virus, how many people are affected, also not spreading fake news. So there have been a number of projects in China in particular that have been looking at how to keep information that may have been censored. So there's a project called Arweave that's trying to index and keep in a decentralized way any censored information and store it on a blockchain so that people can actually see what's been censored and taken away. There's also a couple of other initiatives in China for things like donation tracking. Hyperchain have got a donation tracking platform. They've, I think, got 2 million donated already for coronavirus related sort of help and support. And then, you know, thinking longer term about economic recovery, again, you know, having frictionless sort of e-government solutions. We could think about, you know, rent payments for people struggling with rent, digital wallets for, you know, benefit payments, business loans. That was a very slow process for a lot of small businesses in particular. And I think all of that, if we'd had a lot of this in place beforehand, could have been done in a much, much faster and easier way. So that's just a very kind of quick summary of some of the things, and that there's lots more.
That's great. Sorry, I'm falling in my own petard here of not pressing the unmute button. Genevieve, I see you've joined us. I wonder if you could quickly introduce yourself and what you're working on at the moment in the context of blockchain and COVID-19.
So good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for being late, but I actually was on a call with the World Bank and not throwing words in, but Haiti went live on May 1st, albeit with the COVID pandemic. And we are working through some of the challenges that you have when you're looking to address the value chain. The knowledge that we gained from this allowed us to actually look to put together a response which looks to provide assertion to the value chain. So the WHO has spoke about that testing will be key. So testing for both status in terms of illness and testing for antibody is going to be key. So we've been working for the last month and a half with a number of firms in China to first have independent reviews of their test and their documentation, providing an independent assay review to then drive to where every test will be using a combination of IoT and blockchain. Every test will be registered into the blockchain and also tied to the box that they are supposed to be, creating a chain of custody between test and box, and then allowing for the chain of custody of transfer from the factory all the way to the medical practitioner to then, when an individual takes a test, that test will be unique globally, tamper-free. And if there are any issues along the value chain, such as environmental temperature, then it will invalidate through the smart contract. And prior to that test being administered, provide evidence of that. And we are future-proofing it by creating the reporting ability for the certification windows have been decided by various sovereign countries to be following the W3C and the COVID standards to then be consumed in whichever wallet the individual wants to have.
So that's a really nice summary, and that links in really nicely, Genevieve. You're effectively, you've got linkage between the real world and the data once it's on the blockchain and the provenance and the traceability right through. I guess the initial challenge, and this is something where I'd like to bring Duncan in, is about establishing the identity of people or objects in the first place. And Duncan, I believe you've been involved in that in some way.
Yes, I have, Gary. So in fact, we're working with a company in the States called Quantum Materials Corporation. And they, when we first engaged with them just about a year ago, were very focused on eliminating fraud. So essentially anti-counterfeiting. And it's very much this challenge of mapping between the physical and the virtual world. So you can have you can have all the information immutably stored, but if it's incorrect because you've failed to make that connection between the physical and the virtual world, then you're host. So they're one of a number of companies that are tackling that problem. In their case, they've gone with something called nano dots, so quantum dots, which are essentially a way of uniquely identifying things in the physical world. I won't kind of bore you with the details. It's pretty cool stuff, but essentially beats barcodes and all that kind of stuff. But there are many companies, I should say, in this area. But of course, when COVID happened, then or COVID-19, coronavirus, whatever you want to call it, they pivoted and they've now used the same technology as the basis for helping to identify and marry information about people, practitioners, meaning health practitioners, and test kits, because exactly as Genevieve was saying just now, you do actually need to have a complete picture in order for this information to be of use. And this is all about getting people back to work. So the tagline, if you will, is that DLT is your passport to the return to work. So, but it all starts with being able to uniquely identify the items in the physical world, such as the test kits themselves, and then ensuring that any information related to that is then tied to an individual, which of course raises a whole bunch of issues, I'm sure, Genevieve and Helen, around identity and so on and so forth.
In fact, just before we reintroduce them on that, I might like to bring Jim in on this as well, because Jim, I believe you've got some knowledge or involvement around healthcare IDs and linking people in on that way.
Yes, thanks, Gary. So it is a very complex topic, and I think what's important to understand is really a couple of things. One, that blockchains are really native digital. So there's no real kind of concept of analog data, which is really the world, right? So you do have to, even if you take a simple object like let's say a mug, right, they use, well, what is it exactly digitally, and how do you identify it? That's not a trivial thing, right? So I think sometimes we kind of get lost in the kind of the hype of blockchain and some of these innovative technologies, but some of it honestly is to do with really how do you represent information that is not natively digital, and certainly blockchain is all digital, right? So that's a big concept, it's a big issue. But let's talk about really kind of users of humans, at least in the US. That's a big kind of problem in healthcare, because there is no universal ID. There, I am like 7 different gymnasts on 7 different healthcare systems, and none of them really interoperate, right? Certainly not easily. There's no one identifier. So there are really 2 major problems. One is, well, what is an identifier that identifies Jim as Jim uniquely across all? And right now, really, there isn't one. Right. So what we've tried to do is basically create what we call a national health ID for this COVID project that I was describing, and have really kind of socialized and worked with a number of our partners, including some labs such as LabCorp and Quest and some other folks within this eco that we're working with. And really the thing that's unique about it, other than the fact that the number being unique is not a unique thing, not to overuse the pun, is really the fact that in real time, we are generating that number using basically a blockchain technology. It's called Hedera Hashgraph, which is kind of a next generation distributed ledger technology. But what's really important about, sorry, I'm getting phone calls here, is this idea that we can basically prove, we can mathematically prove the provenance of that number, when it was created, the time sampling that goes with it. And also there's a public ledger that you can reference. So you don't have to take my word for it. You could use any number of third-party explorers to look at it. And also the idea for us is to distribute that as an API. So anybody could use it. Any approved either public health entity or health organization, not like an individual, as example. So that's the first thing. But then the other thing is the other kind of part of the problem is really all to do with, okay, now you have a unique identifier, but how do you know that I really am who I say I am? And then this really kind of gets into this much bigger and more difficult concept of essentially identity management, right? Because that's not just a unique number. That's really all to do with many legacy systems that we currently use. For instance, at the enterprise level, you could have it on an Active Directory, or you could have it on a Ping Federate or things like this. And that's not a problem that's going to go away that quickly. And I think, again, we need to be careful about, well, it's great to have decentralized identities, but not if really they're not interoperable, and not if we're creating more silos, just sexier sounding silos for identity that are, again, non-interoperable. So to me, we just have to be careful about what's doable right now, what's perhaps a reach, but also really there's this idea that we're not going to change legacy systems. Well, certainly not overnight, but it may take a decade or 2 before that happens, right? And managing decentralized identity, the so-called DIDs, that's not a trivial thing to do at all. And basically now saying that essentially users with their phones are now their own central authority for managing identity. That's certainly a huge shift in usability, but also brings up all kinds of other issues such as maintenance, recovery of keys, and things like this. So all to say, I think it's a very interesting area. It's one that I think, practically speaking, as a software practitioner doing this stuff day to day, the promise is really I mean, it has a lot of potential, but the reality requires to temper our enthusiasm.
So coming back to the point, and I was going to introduce Genevieve on this in a moment anyway, because one of the things I always find with DLT or blockchain projects is that you always end up coming back to the identity challenge in some way. And I think you've nailed it there, absolutely, of how you identify people. So Genevieve, you were going to come in on that point as well, I think.
Yeah, so the one thing that I will say is that I'm using what we call so I've had the opportunity to work in the identity space. So that is been both working for an identity provider, having been working with the Estonia government, but also previously dealing with this aspect through my work in Treasury, in global Treasury for both Hewlett-Packard and General Electric, whereby you have to be able to the mandates maintained for the purpose of risk, who are the individual within the organization which are duly authorized to do certain things. And GE was very big on segregating operational versus management, and those needed to have identity through that. So we worked with IdenTrust both at Hewlett-Packard and GE with that, and even some of you might be aware of the work of IdenTrust in the UK with what they do with RBS and also with the ACH processing. So therefore, what we need to look at is this idea of distributed versus this idea of centralized, decentralized, and also self-sovereign. Self-sovereign only works up to a certain level if the individual first has the capability, the need, and the ability to maintain. And what you end up having to do, and what has happened for many years, is that there hasn't been an agreement systematically because there wasn't a need. And I recall now about 5 years ago talking around identity and saying it would take a secondary pandemic to make a change in how we actually start digitally, because identity has been now on the dock as the X509 for almost 30 years, and only banks were forcing their treasury department to use a fully qualified to work at it. The other fundamental challenge that we have is this difference between common law and civil law. Civil law says by the state, it defines who you are, versus common law allows you to actually define who you believe to be. So you tell government what you are. And that is why, as a challenge, identity has never been able to in places like US or the UK, because we have a different way. The law allows us on how we go about. So now changing that, that means that is why I've taken a view of being agnostic and working with service providers, which are both in common and civil law, because how you distribute that information is going to be either mandated by the state or a choice of the individual. So I agree with Jim's idea that there's a challenge, but if you accept that the individual itself is the central part of it and everything else is an attribute which is defined and distributed to them, then you then start creating that process, and then we will have to work with government. And now they're more willing to listen on how do you address those who are unable to do it for themselves. How do you create the trust to be able to distribute? So it's a new world, but I think that fortunately we have the tools.
Yep. And it sounds like you've got what you wished for, unfortunately, that you've got the pandemic, so we need to be careful on that. Duncan, I just wanted to come back to you briefly on this before we move on to another topic, because identity is absolutely critical around this. And I think the work you were talking about with BTP is about creating effectively like a COVID passport, which links in with identity. So how are you tackling the identity challenge with blockchain?
So to be clear, we're doing this in conjunction with Quantum Materials Corporation, are doing the application development. But this is, if I step back from the detail of that particular project, I think it's worth calling out the work that Evanim are doing. I don't know, Genevieve, if you're familiar with this, but the the COVID-19 Credentials Initiative, which is brought together a lot of, so Evonym is the company that's essentially behind this self-sovereign identity project that's now part of Hyperledger. So the idea there is, and I think if you hadn't said it, Genevieve, I would have brought this up too, that we can't do this in small projects here, there, and everywhere. There has to be, or DLT is a technology that can enable certain use cases, but without the participation of and the coming together of things like the World Economic Forum and pulling everyone together, then this is just a whole bunch of projects that are going nowhere. So in the case of the one we're working on, the whole point is to link into an existing identity initiative, not invent yet another identity, because that's the road to ruin.
It's a really good point that it's like anything else. We keep trying to reinvent things, and people keep trying to reinvent new.
It's hubristic. Yeah, I mean, it's hubris in the extreme. Not to take a step back and say, this is only going to solve the world's problem if there is some dare I say it, higher level governance, and that's not, to me at least, contradictory with a decentralized technology that implements some of these concepts.
Absolutely. Hey, let's move on from the identity challenge then, because in some ways, it's nothing new. We're just looking at whether this new technology, blockchain, can help with it. And Helen, I wanted to return to you on the medical opportunities of using blockchain or DLT in some way. So things like vaccine is in the news at the moment. There's loads of projects going on around the world, but what about the clinical trials and that kind of thing? Is anyone actually putting that onto the blockchain?
So I attended a really interesting event in Geneva back in January, before all of this was really taking off in Europe. One of the companies that was presenting there is trying to do a lot of work around sharing clinical trials data on blockchain, and particularly the idea that in clinical trials you often get data sets that don't end up getting used for various reasons. They're sort of abandoned, and there's a lot of potential value to be unlocked from that data if it could be shared, but for commercial reasons companies tend not to want to sort of give that data away. And so their concept was to create sort of a marketplace for that unused data, and because you're able to do it on a distributed ledger, you can first of all keep the data private and anonymized, which is obviously something that's highly important to the individuals that take part in these clinical trials, and we haven't really had a good way in the past of preventing sort of de-anonymization of data. So that's one core part which allows it to work, is it's very secure, much more secure than we've had in the past, but also that companies can potentially create different kinds of intellectual property arrangements and do it all through a decentralized marketplace, so that they could then take some unused data and use it for other purposes. And they can also discover what data is out there, because at the moment it's in the private domain, so they don't know what other companies have sort of on their books. So I think that kind of thing could be very, very valuable, particularly in vaccine research. You see already a lot of pharma companies coming together to partner to, pool resources to work on this, and collaboration approach in all parts of this crisis is so important. I think that's one of the key things that we can do with distributed systems, is bring in private sector, public sector, different companies that might previously have not wanted to collaborate for commercial reasons, and bring them into a network where they have a common incentive to actually collaborate, and they can get benefits from that, both social and also future financial benefit.
So that's interesting where you're talking about the data that you're getting in there, and that ties in nicely. Jim, your company Acor, they've been doing some work where you actually pull in data from the WHO, amongst other things, in order to put like a presentation layer on what the status is. What are your findings to date around that?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and becoming really topical area of I guess, curiosity for a lot of people. And the reason, I think, largely is to do with COVID-19 itself, because there's quite a lot of distrust in information, right? We saw it early on. I think in late January, I was being contacted by some folks, and this was really before even we had done we were one of the very first companies to build a tracker for coronavirus. And really it was because some of our clients reached out and said, hey, we're seeing these things. Is it real? You know, you guys have technologies that help with visualization of data. Can you help with this? So we looked into it, but really the predominant undercurrent was, can we trust this information? Where is it coming from? You know, and then also after we asked that question, the next question is, well, how do we prove to our audience and the folks who attend, who visit our website and our tools that we haven't manipulated data for whatever reasons? So, so I think that's a very important question. And we saw these questions being asked in little small bubbles in January and February, but in massive waves as the months have gone on, right? So that was really the intention we had was, well, let's at the very least prove that anything that we do with the data, as soon as from the point of ingestion from our perspective, we can completely computationally prove, and in real time, that we have not manipulated. We can show every what we call event that's happened to this. Now, of course, we are not a primary data collector, right? We're not WHO or CDC, we're not on the front lines doing this. So we're one step removed from that. However, that same principle certainly can, and I think ought to be applied. And it's, I think, actually a relatively straightforward use case for particularly next generation blockchains, not your traditional kind of proof of work blockchain, because that's too expensive to do. It doesn't make sense to spend $15 to essentially prove that a small piece of data has this kind of provenance. But if you're dealing with next generation DLTs, where the economic cost per transaction could be fractions, like significant fractions of a cent, and could be done in real time, then economically that's viable to do, and that's really what we've done. But I think that the much bigger concept here, Gary, and this is what we're seeing, not just necessarily for public health data or healthcare in general, but also for, like Helen was saying, fake news and many other things, such as authenticity of even like medical records or x-rays and things like this, is really all to do with showing that data provenance.
I think that's fair, and provenance keeps coming back. Helen, did you raise your hand there? Or was that just
Yeah, just to jump in on that, I think the other point that maybe we haven't brought in is the fact that often it's not necessarily the technology that is not there, it's the difficulty of getting all these different groups to collaborate with one another. So I've been working with a healthcare blockchain startup and trying to bring together testing with contact tracing, with a blockchain-based healthcare data management platform. And actually, the roadblocks often either funding related, that funding is not flowing through enough to just fill some small gaps between linking these different organizations together, or it's administrative, or it's the fact that each of the individual people, the people that are doing the testing kits and the people that are doing the app and the people that are doing the blockchain part, all are under extreme pressure from different sources in the current moment and working in different ways. And so actually trying to just get things moving, even though all the individual parts work, the testing works, the app can be done very quickly, and the blockchain platform could be linked in, but actually just getting it all together is a lot more difficult than I think people sometimes realize. Even getting small amounts of funding through for something that's coronavirus related can take actually months. And it's just a lot harder than simply having the technology. It's actually getting these projects that are very important and getting them right and getting people collaborating is just really quite a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Genevieve, I think you were going to add something there.
Yeah, so one of the things that has gotten me excited, and it's actually Helen who's to blame for that, is the whole idea of federated learning. So I'm looking, and I'd love to hear what Jim is doing in that realm. There is one which is visualization, but what we want to be able to do from a blockchain standpoint is to be able to create the ability of different counterparties making requests as to the data set that they need, to creating the algorithm that they have, but never knowing the extent that is available in the data set. The challenge that there is right now is that there's a centralized aspect that needs to happen than to put that the final algorithm together. So I'm actually looking to work with one of the universities in the US to be able to take immense data set and then have the machine actually create the different pieces and in really creating that distribution of data. Because the problem that we have right now in the blockchain, or let's say the challenge that we have, is that there isn't that concept of being able to create a reporting in MIS layer, which just knows which node it should be asking that question from. So
maybe that's something, because Jim, I know you're saying that you're using, I think it's Hedera Hashgraph as like the technology play underlying everything. Does that address the challenges of actually doing analytics on blockchain?
No, I mean, certainly not. I think any blockchain technology is by definition infrastructure. Is like, I often think of it as essentially, if you like, the pipes in your kitchen. It allows water to flow, but in of itself, it certainly doesn't give you application level insight. I think that's really an application development set of skills and technologies and tools, right? I think what blockchain can let you do, especially the more real-time technologies, is really provide that trust layer, that this data that you're, and again, goes back to Genevieve's point as well with federated learning in real time, but it really could be done, honestly, in much more traditional ways too, because, you know, as we all know in healthcare, the single biggest issue, technically speaking, is siloed data, siloed systems. So when you look at federated learning, not to bounce around too much, Gary, but I want to just kind of make a point about Genevieve's comment. But going to federated learning, ultimately, the algorithms are not so much the issue. There are plenty of good algorithms and very bright people coming up with many really interesting and kind of targeted algorithms. The big issue is, how do you build a training data set? How do you get access to these, even if it's completely done in real time, using federated machine learning, right? Which is the concept, and using trusted execution environments and hardware that allows you to encrypt data and things like this. Really, ultimately, the question is, well, where is the data, right? And that's really ultimately the question in healthcare, period, regardless of blockchain. So all to say, going back to your specific question, you know, in our world, blockchain really is our way to essentially assure whoever needs to be assured, but really the public, because I'm a huge believer that if we are going to do blockchain, the path to go is a public DLT. To me, a private enterprise DLT, you know, essentially is you know, just a variation of an extranet. You have a few known nodes who are invited. You know, essentially the governance is pretty much hidden. It's a private appnet. I mean, there's a place for it, don't get me wrong. But when you're talking about like flow of public health data that impacts the world, that being held by 3 people who essentially have veto rights, I don't believe in that. I think there needs to be real provenance at the public level. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting one bit that the data itself is publicly available. That makes no sense. That violates HIPAA, things like this. But every single transaction related to the data, to me, should be available to be inspected on a public DLT. So if, you know, Gary, you say, hey, Jim, you said that you ingested these records from the WHO yesterday at this time. Prove it. Prove that you haven't messed it up. Then we could go using, you know, again, more of an auditable system within, you know, the right level of security provisions. We can demonstrate those things. Anyways, long-winded way, I think that there's really kind of 3 problems here. I think the number 1 problem, which is the biggest problem, is to basically de-silo data. And that's not a problem to integrate. You know, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's really about finding ways to interoperate across existing legacy data sources. The second problem is, how do we make sure that this, you know, interoperability is trustworthy? And the third problem, you know, is really, well, how do we get insight from it? Whether it's through federated machine learning or traditional data visualization technologies, big data, you name it.
So I'd like to rebut on this. I would disagree that it needs to be a public ledger, because if the assumption is to say that everything that is in a private or an enterprise is going to have barrier of entry. The solution that we have built with AgriLedger does not look at it this way. It just looks at it as participant. And we are growing to where we will eventually allow a democratization of access. Of course, you will have to follow the rules of the network. If you don't follow the rules of the network, then the network will have to have the governance to sort of take action, or your services will no longer be ready. However, writing data, I actually believe that writing data versus reading data requires different rights. You can read what I have said, but you can't change it. That doesn't mean, so if you go with those premises, and using the right infrastructure will also allow you to reduce that cost. So what the work we're doing with smallholder farmers in Haiti with mango demands that the cost needs to be pennies. If it is higher than that, then it has no value to them. So I do think that we've come a long way from when I started this journey, and that the conversation that we're able to have now about the possibility of distributed ledger blockchain are so much further than they should be, but we still have a long way to go. This is, to me, we're still playing in access, and we're waiting to happen. And so that's why, for me, the whole idea of reporting is also important, because I need to make the information public, but I don't need to give you all the data so that you can now control. Because at the end of the day, we are learning that that is one of the biggest concern that can be in place. And I think that this kind of forum is important, so that we can highlight it. And I don't know if some of you have seen the principles which were put out, I think, by the UN or WEP. There's one of that just came up with the global, which really is, to me, the ethics that we need to drive into the technology. And that's something that we need to step up and start moving. And COVID really gives us that opportunity, because data is what is going to allow us to really rebuild our economies.
So let's quickly pick up on something that you're mentioning early on, the whole thing about public and private data and everything, because I keep hearing like public blockchains, private blockchains. And Duncan, I think you've expressed an interest in that.
Well, yes. I mean, I've been in this movie before with cloud, and it's a false dichotomy. So I remember when Werner Vogel said, private cloud is false cloud, and then fast forward, and now it suits AWS to actually have hybrid cloud. Well, quelle surprise. So, I think we shouldn't get ourselves wrapped around this particular axle. So mixing my metaphors like crazy, I know, but being permissioned is not the same as being private. It's a complete misunderstanding of the point. And I think, we don't have, we never will have a single blockchain that runs everything. That's an absurdity. I mean, the performance implications are learned. So we're going to end up with with many different networks serving different purposes, at which point what really matters is not whether they're private or public or permissioned or not, it's whether they can interoperate. And when I say interoperate, I mean really interoperate. So, and at that point, I think you have to leave behind what a good friend of mine, Liam Bell, calls the ideology of blockchain. So blockchain without the ideology is it's not Hedera Hashgraph versus this versus Neo versus whatever. It's far more about, can we operate and capture things at the smart contract level. And we have a sort of we have a pony in this race, in the sense that we're one of the founding members of the Interwork Alliance, which is trying to take and draw upon and build upon the work of the token taxonomy initiative, and say it's not just about getting tokenization right, it's about the contracts that then you need to actually reason about those, and then the analytics that you can then derive from that. So, but we are in a hybrid world. Let's just not, let's forget this false dichotomy of public versus private.
I think that's absolutely a valid thing. And that's really interesting. Again, I'm just going to use the next few minutes to explore the theme a little bit further before we hand over to the audience for any questions, of which we've had one in the chat so far. Well, welcome you to type any more questions in, or we can wait until the actual session. But I just wanted to quickly explore with each of you. I've seen it that, you know, blockchain's nothing new. Blockchain seems to be the new buzzword to get projects through. It seems currently that COVID-19 is the buzzword to get stuff done. You know, so right now you need on your business case, you know, solves COVID or addresses COVID. And I just wondered, going back to the blockchain thing, can anyone give me any simple, short examples of what difference using blockchain actually makes in this COVID world? And Helen, if I can oblige by picking on you to begin with, to think, you know, the so what factor, what difference would using a blockchain make?
I think it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning about, you know, the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So we need solutions that are able to work remotely. We need solutions that allow people to collaborate, you know, not just within their own sector, but across sectors. And we need things that are not necessarily just driven by centralized processes, particularly, you know, the debate about contact tracing, I think is really interesting. You know, should it be centralized? UK NHS says that'll make that process a lot more easy for us, so we'd rather go with a central route. A lot of technical experts say no, it has to be decentralized if it's ever going to be sort of any use, you know, for various reasons, both security, sort of, you know, public confidence, but also how you actually then use that data afterwards to understand what's actually happened. And obviously I prefer the decentralized option. And I think, you know, that is part of it really, is, you know, what would you then do with all those data sets if you're able to find out how many people had COVID, you know, how it was spread, what kind of, you know, genetic factors there might be within an individual that makes them more prone to getting coronavirus. That requires then a lot of analysis from scientists all over the world. Are you going to be able to do that more easily with a centralized government database, or with a decentralized data set that could be interrogated in different ways? To me, I think the decentralized opens up much more possibility for, you know, both commercial research and public funded research. So that's why I'm a fan of it.
That's excellent, particularly the idea that a decentralized world allows governments to share things. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, and you see, I mean, just to add to that, you see, you know, different countries have approached this in very different ways in terms of contact tracing, in terms of kind of lockdown approaches and so on. And what we actually need, I think, is a lot more, not just on COVID, but in general, a lot more smooth mechanisms for policymakers to actually share best practice and how they've approached different problems. And most of our problems are global, whether it's climate change, whether it's pandemics, whether it's, you know, assistance for people being affected by these situations of massive changes in weather and so on. We need a much faster way of doing that, and at the moment it just moves too slowly. So that was one of the reasons for starting GovChain, was to try and accelerate that exchange of, you know, innovation within government, not just within the tech world, but within the policymaking process.
There we go. So we might be able to get blockchain to drive governments faster. I was going to ask Duncan, Genevieve, and then Jim a similar kind of question, really, of, you know, is there anything you are seeing addressing COVID-19 where blockchain is particularly well suited, or are we just using the B word to get funding again? Duncan, I know you're a sensible cynic in this regard. Perhaps you could share your thoughts.
Cynic, I don't know. I think when we were preparing for this call, I said I was cynical of virtue signaling, where people say, you know, I've got the answer to COVID-19, and, you know, I think let's park that. Let's instead answer your question, which really, I think we've touched on this throughout this conversation. I think one of the heart of anything to do with you know, decentralized DLT-based solution is really the idea of self-sovereign identity. And so this is about having control over your identity and aspects of it, and what you're prepared to share or reveal to other people. And I'll give you an example from my wild years. So I grew up in the 80s, the height of the HIV thing. And there was a real stigma associated with having a HIV test. And you had no idea, I took one, but you had no idea who would get hold of that information. You then had to disclose that on insurance and God knows what else. And to me, that was a real infringement of my personal liberty. And so it's, you know, maybe it's a very old example, but, you know, it applies, I'd say, even more fiatori nowadays. So to me, self-sovereign identity is really the crux of the matter, and everything else flows from that, whatever people are doing. So that's my view.
Excellent, thank you for that. And Genevieve, is there anything where blockchain makes the real difference?
I think that there's one thing we're not talking about here, which is one of the things that we have implemented in the solution that we did in AgriLedger, which is not only about the traceability, but using the smart contract to also track the financial obligation. So when you start talking about value chain, and many of the things that we're looking to solve with COVID are really around value chain and obligations which have been created. So that with the blockchain and the use of smart contract, you can actually start looking at mechanism by which you have an understanding of what the obligations can be, and you can start really using performance payments. So when we look at the situation in the supply chain of, let's say, the test or the PPE, at this time, it's about most manufacturers are asking for 100%. And they may be asking 100% of a cost, which is much less, and they are the different counterparties, which I'm not going to call intermediaries, or because they sometimes bring value into the transaction and they should be compensated, but there isn't transparency as to what actual costs are. You may not need to have complete transparency, but you also need to be able to maintain some sort of mechanism by which you don't need to have very expensive letter of credits or have expensive escrow account, but use the technology to foster those payments in a way which allows for every party to have a reduction in the risk. So I think it's now just not about tracing only, it's about obligations, and then using the smart contract to distribute payments in a much more effective way.
That's great. Thank you for that. And Jim, finally, just before we hand over to the Q&A for the audience, do you have anything where you believe that blockchain is a real differentiator and makes a difference in this space?
Yeah, absolutely, Gary. In fact, there are two things that we have done that's production already and it's being used with our COVID-19 apps that are being white labeled for various purposes. So the two things are, one is the National Health ID that I described at the beginning. All of that is being generated in real time using Hedera Consensus Service, and again, is in the public ledger. And I do want to kind of clarify, that this idea of using a public ledger is not putting data on the public ledger, it's a reference to the data. So that's not the same, right? So not to, again, get into that topic too much. But then the second thing we're doing is that through the mobile app, we have a questionnaire. So we adopt CDC's go back to work guidelines and they get updated. But those, basically the responses that you provide, such as you have fever or whatever, every one of those, there is an encrypted reference, a hash reference of that's recorded on the public ledger, as well as the medical endpoint, which is, the recommendation from our app is that you go back to work because you're asymptomatic, or that we recommend that you get what we call a secure testing, which means that we create a pre-order for you to go to LabCorp or Quest. Every one of those medical endpoints for that particular NHI, for that particular patient ID is recorded on the public blockchain in production right now. So again, this kind of goes back to this whole idea of really proving the provenance of important healthcare decisions.
It's a good call. That's really good. Okay, we thank you everybody for your thinking around that, because it really does help to address the thing that I get asked Stephen now of, so what with blockchain? Can't we address things in different ways? And it sounds like you've all given some really great examples around that. I just wanted to open up in the last few minutes. We've had one question that's been posed from the audience via the chat facility. I don't know if anyone has any other questions. So I'm just going to read out probably part of this, because otherwise it'll take me the remaining few minutes to actually ask the question without getting an answer. And I'm not sure who's the best person on the panel to answer this. So whoever puts their hand up first, go for it. And it just says from Nan, it says, I was wondering if blockchain could be used for de-identifying genetic data in medical databases, given that DNA is currently re-identifiable. And they've been looking specifically in terms of very vulnerable people and things like, mass grave victims and their families. And whilst this person doesn't know enough genetic to understand it, wonders, if blockchain could be used in some way for that. Genevieve, your hand's up first.
So my answer to this is that it is possible, but then we need to ask ourselves, what is the cost and value that is derived from there? And why would you put it, I think we still need to ask the questions as to why would you put it into a blockchain? It's, yes, at the end, maybe in 5 to 10 years from now, we won't be asking why you're putting in a distributed ledger, because that's the technology that is used widely. But these kind of solutions can be very expensive to maintain. And also it's not just about the database, it's also the processes to gather that information. So my whole thing would be more, I would ask, is there an opportunity to be able to create, it's really a trust mechanism. Is there a lack of trust there? What is the purpose, and also what is the cost benefits?
That's great. Thank you for that, Jenny. Well, we haven't had any other questions through, so I just wanted to quickly wrap up that I'd like to thank the panel for all the contributions. It's really interesting, and particularly from my perspective, listening, I'm hearing about blockchain being used in the COVID crisis around identity issues, trust, provenance data, data sharing versus silo data, and it all comes down a lot of the time to politics and funding. So it's kind of interesting. It's actually nothing new. With all of that, I've heard that with pretty much any other previous technology we've come through, but hopefully we've given some examples today about how DLT could actually make a difference. So I'll close by thanking the panelists for the contributions. Thank you for your time. I hope the audience have enjoyed this as well, and I'll pass back to Hugo at techUK.